So after trying out all classes, getting them all maxed out, as well as testing a couple of later game builds, I want to give my full opinions, early game opinions. Again, we can only get to level 25 in the beta for each of these classes. We're going to rank them based on their damage, their mobility, their survivability, and their versatility. Based on these scores, we're going to rank them best to worst, starting off with the best here. And because I already know the scores, I know which classes to go for, but I'll just say right off the bat, guys, we actually have a three-way tie in terms of the total score between Rogue, Necromancer, and Sorcerer for different reasons, because I think all three of these classes are exceptionally good. And honestly, I didn't really have any troubles leveling with any of them. And their later game power was super strong, as with honestly all these classes, but Barbarian and Druid had a lot more hard time actually leveling. Let's dive into the categories and then dive into the classes. So diving into the categories real quick, just to describe what's being rated in each of these categories. Damage, pretty self-explanatory. How much damage are you able to do? Mainly for those bosses, because almost every class has a good amount of AoE, although the AoE is also a factor inside the damage based on some builds that we have. The second category, mobility. How are we moving? What are we doing to stay moving? So you can either have dashing abilities, teleporting abilities. Can you get extra movement speed? Can you move and attack, or do you have to be stationary? All of these things decide your mobility. Survivability. Now, survivability category, this could be a lot of different things. Is it just strict HP pool? Is it because you could stay at range and avoid hits? Are you getting some sort of barrier to defend all damage? Again, all of these factor into your survivability. And then versatility. This is a category that I was trying to decide whether or not I wanted to include, and I ended up including it because I figured some people would find it interesting. And that is, are the characters, or can the classes actually have options to choose other builds? Or are they kind of locked into a couple builds that seem to be better than all the other ones based on the luxury items that we have? Or do they have any support abilities? I will say that I find the versatility category a lot less important than all the other ones. And so although we have the overall average scores, I'm also going to be rating some of the earlier classes a little bit differently, just because I find, some of their scores a little bit, I guess you could say, differently in terms of the overall scheme of the game. Not every score is rated equally, is basically what I'm saying. So let's talk about the best class in the Diablo 4 beta and potentially on launch as well, and that is the Necromancer. Now, I've seen some people talk about the Necromancer, but let's dive into each of these categories and talk about damage first. Now, they actually have some pretty good basics, but this is honestly something that I don't care about. I know some people think that this is the reason, a lot of the reasons why they're so good, but to be honest, I don't even care about the basics. Why? Because Necromancer, in my opinion, has something even more broken, and that is that the corpse explosion costs nothing and actually can be amplified to become a essence generator. So typically your basic skills are used as a generator for your main resource. What this means is that usually your core skill is the strongest, and in this build it is, and then your basics are used to generate enough essence to use your core skill. However, for the Necromancer, they have something interesting going on, which is that Corpse Explosion costs nothing and can generate your essence for you. Now, due to this combo of having Corpse Explosion generate essence and then Bone Spear being the essence spender, you have some massive damage potential. Combo that with one of the strongest legendary items in the game, which is this one, Blood Mist triggering Corpse Explosion. This is going to give you essentially infinite corpses with Blood Mist, triggering corpses, allowing you to spam Bone Spear for massive damage, and then coming out of it and triggering all those corpses for massive essence generation, also doing a ton of damage, and then just going back and cycling that rotation. This is huge. Okay, this is super big in terms of a build. But that's not the only thing, because also you have to include that because it's a beta, because we're going to level 25, I'm also including the leveling process. And Necromancer actually starts out with an ability that no one else does at the beginning of the game, and that's just the raised skeleton army. Now what's interesting about this is that these actually do a lot of damage in the early game, a lot of damage. Even now they do a lot of damage, and so they actually become some of the strongest things in the game because each one of these skeletons can actually out DPS almost every other class in the earlier levels. Now later on they fall off, and that's why you have to use a bone spear or some other ability to do a ton of damage. That doesn't mean that their damage really falls off at all, because Bone Spear does comparable damage to almost any other core skill, if not more than a lot of them, as well as having a ton of AoE due to the nature that Bone Spear pierces and then comes back at you. Super insane. The next category is mobility, and honestly this one's a pretty quick one, guys. They have a 2 out of 10. There's only one reason why I don't have them at 1, and that is because of the Blood Mist. Blood Mist makes you become immune. Now, it does reduce your movement speed, but allows you to move and essentially blow up people as you move, which to me warrants not quite a 1, where it's just you can't move at all, you're just staying in place, and you have no additional way to kind of change the way you attack and things like that. But it's not good at all. The Necromancer is very slow. It doesn't do much besides walk and then have the minions tank or just you destroying anyways. And so their mobility, again, this is just not something that Necromancer has, and so it gets a 2 for that. And to be honest, that's actually a big downside. But I think that typically your damage and your survivability makes up for it, which we're going to get to next, and I have their survivability at a 10. Now, some people, as I've seen, will rate a class based on what they think will happen. I am literally just rating my experience as well as what I think the classes shape up at the end of the beta. And to be honest, there is a literal permanent immunity build for the Necromancer right now that makes them invincible, and that is the Blood Mist build. This is why I keep talking about this skill. You can be permanently immune to damage in the Blood Mist skill. It is a little dumb and probably will be nerfed, but based on the beta, this is just stupid, okay? It probably should be nerfed, but that's not the only thing that's dumb and makes them extremely survivable, okay? They also have a lot of options. For one, their survivability is super high in the early game, even when you don't have any of this, because their skeletal minions actually tank for you and will provide a barrier for you, okay? So this basically allows you to be immune to all damage and have them soak up a ton of the damage. So their survivability is super high just because of that. Not only that, but they also have a lot of options for healing and potentially blood orb builds, which are pretty solid and give you a lot of healing and options for essence generation, which is really powerful as well. So they're immediate 10 for me in terms of survivability. Now let's move on to versatility. How many options do you have? What can you do with this? Can you run a support? To me, the Necro gets a 10 for this one as well. Why? Because you actually have a lot of options to potentially increase your damage, slow down enemies, have potential support skills, or even to go with multiple different builds. You have the Blood Mist Pure Corpse Explosion build, you have the Bone Spear, you have the basic oriented build, you have the Summon type build. On top of that, you have potentially your Blood Surge build. There's a lot of builds that I felt like were extremely viable and honestly quite good, and so because of that, they are getting an absolute 10 in terms of versatility for me as well. Now, one thing to note about this is that you really have to dive into your Book of the Dead and class ability to get the versatility as well, because this is where you get to see, okay, do I want to amplify my solo build and get some crazy build going, or do I want to have some certain pieces available, certain summons available? And depending on where you want to go with this really determines how much you can do with all the skills that you have. So a really interesting class with some decent support skills, a lot of damage, a ton of options, and overall very survivable. Absolute S tier, #1 class for me in the open beta. The next class up is going to be the Sorcerer. Now, starting out with the Sorcerer here, we have to talk about the damage. One of the best things about the Sorcerer is how lazy their damage is. One of the best skills so far is the Hydra, especially if you get a certain legendary item that allows you to place multiple Hydras. The amount of passive damage that you can pump out is absolutely absurd. Another skill here, especially in the early game, Arc Lash. This is something that I actually didn't realize how strong it would be, but it's actually an AoE that does a lot of damage, and an AoE basic that does a lot of damage is absolutely absurd for the leveling process. Couple that with one of the strongest core skills in the game, Chain Lightning, which allows you to bounce the Chain Lightning off yourself, which allows your core skill to hit for potentially damage like 900 damage a hit, which is more damage, again, not 900 damage actual number, but 900 damage in terms of skill in the skill menu, is just absurd. So much damage can be pumped out from the Sorcerer early on, and then as you go later, you're going to get so much lazy damage in Hydra, and potentially some of your enchantment systems. So for me, damage is a 9 for the Sorcerer. It is rather a step down from the Necro in my opinion, but they do have a lot more options in terms of just dropping their damage and moving on, whereas the Necro really does have to pay attention. The second stat is mobility. Now for the mobility in the Sorcerer skills, I would say is a solid 6. They do have some options. Most importantly, they do have things like teleport to use, right, which is honestly a decent skill. It's going to give you a little bit of an option for teleporting, allowing you to teleport decently long range, but the cooldown is long and you can't necessarily spam it. You do have some movement speed generation in some of your skills, which is nice, and you have some combinations with barrier that can increase your movement speed, but overall they don't really have anything too stand out ish. So I think 6 is a pretty solid number for a class that has some okay movement abilities but isn't super consistent. When we get to something like the Rogue, you'll understand what I mean by absolutely disgusting mobility. Okay, as for survivability, the Sorcerer gets an immediate 10. And there's really only one reason for this, okay? And it's this skill, I guess, expansion right here. Align the elements and protection. So this is going to give you essentially 50% damage reduction against elites if you haven't taken damage. And then protection gives you barrier whenever you use a cooldown. So the idea here is similar to how Wizard works in Diablo 3, you want to stack barrier so you don't take any damage to prevent the skills that say when you take damage you fall off, preventing it from falling off. So for example, if you play Diablo 3, a lot of barrier generation prevents Squirt's necklace from, losing that 100% increased damage. And the same thing applies in this game, where when you run a barrier, you're gonna have basically 50% permanent damage reduction against elites. And you can always have barrier between ice armor, your protection, and some other options that we have in legendary items. It's so insane. It makes the Sorcerer basically be invincible all the time. And you could also scale this and have things that actually give you more damage if you have barrier. So it's a kind of a 2-for-1 combo. Super strong, absolutely absurd, and something that I really enjoy. Lastly, we have the versatility, and I would put the versatility at about a 7. I think you do have some options. Some skills can be swapped out, like you can take teleport, which I don't like to do. You do want to take the barrier. There are some options for skills down here. There are some options for ultimates as well. But I will say you could potentially drop this down a little bit. I do think they have a lot of viable builds, but there does seem to be one clear-cut optimal option, and I think Chain Lightning tends to be that option, as well as always running Hydra. Hydra is just so strong, it's hard to not run that, especially when you have something like double Hydra legendary items. It's one of the strongest legendary items in the game, and it makes everything so trivial. And so I think that in that case you might be able to drop down the versatility, but overall it does have options, and all the options are quite solid. For example, right now I decided to try a Fire Wizard, and although it's significantly worse than the standard Lightning Wizard, it still does amazing damage and is comparable to other classes as well. That being said, that's gonna wrap up the Sorcerer here. I was gonna say Wizard, and we're gonna move on to the Rogue next. Next up is the Rogue, and I've been back and forth on which class I enjoyed playing the most, but I think at the end of the day it ended up being the Rogue. The Rogue is just so much fun, and there's really one main reason for that, and that is the amount of damage and mobility you can get out of this class. Talking about the damage, first off, it comes out as a 9. There is some really powerful twisting blades builds, some really powerful piercing shot builds, and some really powerful barrage builds. All of them seem to be pretty solid and give you a lot of options, but most importantly, twisting blades just does so much damage and allows you to potentially reset some of your other cooldowns. Couple that with shadow imbuement or even poison imbuement for extra poison damage or burst AoE damage. You have so many options to do a ton of damage on the rogue here, and their burst damage is absolutely absurd, especially for bosses. Couple that with the legendary item that allows your twisting blades to float in a kind of a circle around you. It just is so good. And honestly, the rogue is probably closer to contending with the Necromancer than the Sorcerer is. And I've been really impressed with the rogue. So a 9, I think, is pretty fair for the rogue. Let's talk about mobility. And this is where rogue, in my opinion, has its identity. Sorcerer has sort of that super high survivability, running through, doing a lot of damage, and keep moving type playstyle. Necromancer has that just straight up hardcore damage. I just plow through everything like a tank type playstyle. And the rogue has that hit and run. I hit something, I jump around, I kill everything that I run through, and continue moving on as long as I'm able to combo together. And there's two main reasons for that. If we look at the skills here, Shadow Step and Dash. Now, the cool thing with Shadow Step is that if you actually go ahead and get the upgrades, what can happen is you gain 50% movement speed, okay, after you use this. So that's already insane. But you also can reduce the cooldown, and then your twisting blades can reduce your cooldown even further, allowing you to shadow step basically every single time you want to move to the next area. Now, shadow step, you basically jump to someone at any point in the screen and you backstab them. What's really cool is that you're going to drag the blades through everyone that you backstab, and so you can go ahead and again reset that shadow step cooldown, as well as get you that movement speed and all that good stuff. But not only do you have shadow step, but you also have a dash, which is just a dash. Like, just to show you all, I mean, this is an absolute 10 in mobility. I can walk around, I'm like dodging around, I'm dashing, let's say I'm dashing to the next area. Oh no, I want to change up my place. I can just shadow step, and then, I can move to the next area. It is just so insane. Shadow step again. Oh, let's hit the twisting blades. Let's dash through this one. Oh, now I have shadow step back up again. I mean, look how crazy this is compared to the other classes. That you're gonna see. Like, the rogue's mobility is so crazy good, and this is one of the reasons why the rogue to me felt so enjoyable, because you're just cruising through everything in the game. High damage coupled with high mobility makes the rogue a super dangerous enemy. In terms of survivability, this one's a little bit tougher. I think for me, I probably would put their survivability at around a 6. You can run some pretty good defensive skills like Dark Shroud or Concealment. The thing with these skills is that they are a little bit more nuanced than your other survivability skills. They don't give you like permanent immunity or just straight up damage reduction permanently with barrier or anything like that. They are solid, but they're not super amazing. And so it's not the worst, but it's also not something that I would rate pretty highly overall. But you can, and you do have a few options. Next, we talk about versatility. And in terms of versatility for the rogue, I would put it at around a 6. They really have very little support skills, besides, potentially, like, I guess, increasing your damage through vulnerability, although a lot of classes have that, so I don't know if it's necessarily something super amazing with the rogue. They do have a couple builds available to them, specifically a melee and ranged build, specifically with things like Barrage, I think is one of the really cool ranged builds available to you. I think that also increases their versatility, but overall, I think Twisting Blades is, generally speaking, one of the stronger combos. Penetrating Shot actually does have some options as well, but I generally don't think it's as good as things like Twisting Blade, for example. So that's going to be the rogue, number 3. Let's move on to the other two classes. I think these first three are pretty similar. I wouldn't be too fussed if someone would say, oh yeah, Rogue's the best character or Sorcerer's the best character. I think these are pretty good classes overall. I think some people actually underrate the Rogue a little bit, but they're all very, very good. So Barb is the next one up, and I think Barbarian gets a bad rap just because of their pretty annoying early game experience, and since they're melee, and I think that Diablo does have a big problem with their melee imbalance at the current moment. Starting off with their damage, I think their damage is an absolute 8. This might be a hot take, and for some reason I cannot enter the gatehouse over here, but their damage is really strong with a couple different builds. The Barbarian actually has the absolute highest single hit build with the Upheaval build. So arguably you could even put them out of 10 because they could crit so high numbers. But the thing is, it's not as consistent as a lot of the other builds. And therefore, I think that consistency for killing off the elites and such is going to be a little bit more important. However, they also have the Thorns build, they have the Bleed build, they have the combo Bleed Thorns build, they have Whirlwind builds. They actually have a lot of options, and they're all pretty solid. I think that the Bleed and Whirlwind build are a touch down from, the Sorcerer, the Rogue, and things like that. I also think that the Upheaval build, although it's very high damage, it makes it so that it's not super consistent and common. And so overall, I think that the Barbarian does have some things going for it, but not quite as consistent as the other classes. So an 8 seems to make sense for me. As for mobility, Barbarian gets a 6. They do have some mobility skills like Charge, like Leap. Both these are decent mobility skills, and they have things like Whirlwind allowing them to move and attack. The problem is that Leap and Charge both are very short distances with very long cooldowns, and you have to invest a lot of points into them to reduce those cooldowns if you truly want to. This makes me very, very, uninterested in that. And then also Whirlwind, although you can use it, I think it's a lot worse than the other options that the Barbarian has when you start to get later on into the levels. And it's just not quite as fun if you're running that. So I would say that 6 seems fair for the mobility for Barb. I do think that you have a couple options, but they're not particularly great options. As for survivability, I think that the Barb actually has an 8, despite it actually being melee. The reason for this is one of the best builds is the Thorns / maximum life scaling build. And I think that even if you're running Upheaval, running a little bit of extra life can be very, very good, or even running Challenging Shout for extra damage reduction. These are all very, very good skills. Coupled with that, with sort of like this melee kind of scaling that maximum life, I think you have a lot of options to be survivable as the Barb if you truly care about that. You have things like additional maximum life, additional damage reduction, and all this good stuff if you choose to be survivable. Again, you can run a glass cannon build as the Barb and do some major damage, or you can kind of run a very good damaging build with high survivability. I think people underrate that. As for versatility, as the Barb, I would give this an 8. Again, we've talked about a lot of different builds that you can run, but not only that, but I think Barb has some of the strongest support skills in the entire game. Between Challenging Shout, Rallying Cry, and War Cry, increasing potential massive damage increasing for your teammates 30%, Rallying Cry increasing resource generation, movement speed, and potentially giving you additional resource generation, Challenging Shout causing a taunt so no one can get hit. You have some massive abilities to support your team, which is super underrated because we haven't really dove into team play yet later on in the game. So I think that overall the versatility for the Barb is going to be super amazing. And anytime I ran in a group and had a Barb, I would always run Warcry, or if I was a Barb, I would always encourage Warcry and Rallying Cry because they're just so good for the whole party. Have a lot of options already within their own builds, but also have a lot of options for their party members as well. Super interesting class. I think it's honestly got a bad rap, and I think it really is a lot better than people think. Same with the Druid, which we're going to go over next, but I think the Druid is a noticeable step down from every other class. Let's get into it. Lastly, the Druid. Now, this is, as I mentioned earlier, the class I probably spent the most time with, just because a lot of people felt like it was really bad. So I wanted to test a lot of different things about it, see if it really was as bad as people say. And I will say, compared to every other character on this list, the leveling process was a little bit slower until the early teens, when I was able to actually get some options for my build rolling and start to do a lot of damage with Landslide. Now, let's dive into the damage numbers for the Druid. I gave them a 7. They actually have some really good damaging options. However, overall, I would say that their damage is not as good as every other class. They're not nearly as low as people claim. People that are claiming that they have really low damage numbers just don't really run the right skills. Now, this is going to hurt their versatility a little bit, because I do think that a lot of their skills are pretty poor. But also, I think that a lot of people played the Druid. They had a pretty poor, really early experience, seeing that they did no damage. And then because of that, they just claim that the Druid does no damage. If you watch my previous video, Druid actually has a lot of options to one-shot elites, delete bosses in like 4 or 5 seconds, and do some insane combos. You just need a little bit of setup, or actually I would say a lot more setup than any other class. And that is the problem with it, is that they require more effort, but their actual end game damage, or rather the end goal damage at level 25, is actually pretty good, and potentially even better than some other classes in a lot of cases. As for mobility, they get a 3. They are absolute slugs, and the only ability to move that they have realistically is the option to potentially be unstoppable and increase their movement speed that way. I think that this could potentially be lowered even more so, because you also do actually have some options in some movement speed, and so a little bit of, movement abilities here, not like movement abilities, but like a little bit more movement here within the Druid. But to be honest, it's pretty bad, and I could see even dropping that to potentially even a 2, or even potentially a 1, if you would like to include some legendaries. Although I do include some legendary potentials here, with some, a little bit of movement speed, a little bit of unstoppable. I think that actually is a pretty good option, which something like the Necromancer doesn't really have, and therefore that's why they're a little bit lower than the Druid. And of course, the Druid does have some options in skills as well to kind of make their process of moving around a little bit easier, but it is pretty bad. So moving on to survivability, I'm going to put their survivability at a 7. They have a lot of options to fortify, and for those of you that don't know, fortify makes you take 10% reduced damage. Couple that with a lot of options like Storm Strike, which gives 25% damage reduction. I think their survivability is actually quite good despite being melee. Not quite as good as the Barbarian, but is quite solid. I think people understate the survivability on the Druid, especially with wolves, similar to how the Necromancer has like the tanking options with the skeleton warriors and things like that. The wolves also do a similar thing for the Druid, and I think people again underrate the wolves, underrate the earth barrier, underrate the fortify mechanics within their skills and their combos potential. I think a lot of these things are super core to the Druid and make it a lot of survivability options. On top of that, they have a lot of CC, which not really any other class offers comparatively in a lot of their typical builds. The Barbarian is probably the closest one, but the Necromancer with the Bone Spear Corpse Explosion doesn't really offer much CC. Sorcerer with Chain Lightning and Arclash doesn't really offer much CC. The Rogue doesn't. So the Druid really only has the big CC, and they do a ton of CC, immobilize, stunning, and all that good stuff within their kits. So I think that is also another option for survivability as well. As for versatility, Here's where the versatility suffers a little bit and is the lowest on this list. And that is because a lot of the skills are undertuned and basically force you into a couple of builds for the Druid, more so than any other class. However, I would have put it lower if they did not have a couple of options for potential support grouping scaling. Okay. Now, the problem with this is that, like, if you look through here, the damage numbers just seem so low. Like, let's look at Hurricane, right? So Hurricane is like your big heavy hitter skill, 20-second cooldown, damage over time 8 seconds. At maximum does 500 damage over 8 seconds with a cooldown of 20 seconds. You're most likely not going to keep the characters in there for the full 8 seconds unless it's a boss, and even then it might not be for the full 8 seconds. And it's a 20-second cooldown. Compare that to a singular landslide, and the base version of landslide does more damage. This isn't even including the fact that this can crit, guaranteed crit with some of the enhancements, as well as a lot of amplifiers according to it as well. And you just look at something like Hurricane and you're like, why? Or Boulder even, or even Trample. All these just seem so like, why? Why is that so low? Why am I doing 0 damage? Even if you compare like landslide to other core skills, you're looking at like super slow damage or things that you have to get into melee range for that lower your damage by nature of being forced into melee range. So overall, the versatility suffers a lot for the Druid because I really do think that there are only a couple of viable options for you. And that's why people think the Druid is so bad, is because there's only a couple options. And if you don't do those options, it feels pretty miserable. Okay. So overall, I think Druid is definitely the worst class in the game. Specifically, their early leveling is really, really bad. And the fact that if you're a casual player, you load up the Druid and you can't just pick any skill on the list and be okay, that's a problem. I think that the Barbarian also has this problem, whereas the Sorcerer, the Rogue, and the Druid, the Necromancer, if you just pick a random skill, you're probably going to be fine. You don't even need a build. Whereas the Barbarian and the Druid, I do think you need a build, and therefore I think that they have kind of a problem in terms of the early game leveling process, unless you are a little bit more tryhard. And they already said they don't want to gatekeep, classes behind skill level, so get on it, Blizzard. But that's going to wrap up the tier list, or the best to worst list. Let me know if you guys agree. Let me know if you disagree. I do think that both Druid and Barbarian are actually underrated. I think people really dump on Druid, especially their damage numbers, and I hardcore disagree with that. There is some options for Druid, it just takes a lot more effort. Let me know what you think in the comment section down below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you all for the next one.